Humans have traded with one another since the beginning of civilization. Trade gives us access to new foods, products, and experiences, and creates economic opportunity and markets. However, the type of trade we will be talking about today is free trade.
The definition of free trade is the unrestricted purchase and sale of goods and services between countries without the imposition of constraints such as tariffs, duties, and quotas. Though the actual term implies that free trade can be found all over the world, only a few examples are found today. These can be exemplified by the European Economic Area and the North American Free Trade Agreement.
The European Economic Community was created after the Second World War. It was originally created as a solely economic partnership between Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, in the belief that independent economic countries are more likely to avoid conflict. From this community, the European Union was formed in 1993. It differs from the European Economic Community due to its large spectrum of policies concerning different issues such as environmental, in comparison to the solely economic policies of the European Economic Community. Free trade was a founding policy of the European Union, as demonstrated by the following quote. The EEA agreement provides for the inclusion of EU legislation covering the four freedoms: the freedom of movement, goods, services, persons, and capital, throughout the 30 EEA states, according to the EFTA. The EU, composed of 28 countries, is responsible for 20% of the world's imports and exports, and is therefore the world's largest trader. The Common Agricultural Policy, otherwise known as the CPA, aims specifically at the free trade of food in the European Union. The Common Agricultural Policy, otherwise known as the CPA, was created in 1962 to ensure food security and European interest in world trade. Its key objectives were to increase agricultural production. However, this objective is no longer relevant due to the large reforms in relation to food production over the past few decades. This is shown by the following quote. By the 1980s, the CAP's financial incentives for food production and investment led to massive overproduction. And this in turn led to great quantities of tax money used for the sole purpose of buying excess product on the market. The next key objective in the Common Agricultural Policy objectives was to ensure a fair standard of living for agricultural producers and to stabilize markets. To do this, a stable target price for farmers through subsidizing industries was created. For example, a recent article in the New York Times highlighted the recent butter mountain that has been formed due to the large quantities of butters being bought by the CPA in hope of increasing butter prices due to the surplus in the market. For each food product, there is also a certain intervention price at which the CPA will take surplus product off the market in hope of sustaining a reasonable price for the farmers and keeping them in business. The next objective was to ensure reasonable prices to customers. However, the CPA has been very unsuccessful in doing this, as the EU has some of the highest food prices in the world. This is shown by the following quote. In fact, with countries outside the EU generally able to produce agricultural products at far lower prices than member states, either because of enormous size and the scale of their industries, e.g. the USA or Canada, or due to lower standards, e.g. the developing world. The EU is largely keeping prices up, according to politics.co.uk. The final key objective was to maintain commodity price levels by taxing imports and subsidizing exports. The CPA, however, has done this quite effectively and has been able in turn to maintain the livelihood of farmers They have done this by taxing imports and keeping European food products competitive. The following quote shows this. Some 90% of EU produce is protected in some way by the CPA, with some 70% in receipt of supporting prices, according to politics.co.uk. The CPA further protects food products such as meat and poultry products, sugar, fish and dairy products, cereals and rice products, products of the milling industry such as flour, fruit and vegetables, nuts, grains and seeds, wines and spirits, and finally milk and milk products.
Here are the negative implications of free trade. The first point is the removal of protectionism. While some see this as a positive thing, countries place these boundaries to protect a specific industry, thus protecting jobs and resources. Removing these barriers may undercut the cost of labor. For example, if the USA were to have a free trade agreement with China, their automotive industry would be at risk. This is because Chinese factory workers require less in wages, so they can effectively produce goods for less money. This would make them more attractive to businesses and countries. Secondly, while some countries attempt to cut costs to gain an advantage on other countries, their workers may suffer. For example, they may end up facing lower pay, substandard working conditions, forced labor, and maybe even child labor. This argument is known as the race to the bottom by many critics and is often one of the key protests aimed at the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. This next point is highly disputed. Some critics say that the increase of corporate farms means the increase of pesticides and other chemicals, meaning that the host countries would ignore environmental standards in favor of a higher yield and a cheaper production rate. Also, countries would have no way to show their disagreement, as they would be unable to place barriers on food that were not environmentally produced. Fourthly, free trade would mean that domestic countries have to work harder for domestic attention. This is because domestic consumers have cheaper, or maybe more valuable, options. However, this factor is a positive for many consumers who do not benefit from the local or domestic products that they have access to. So, in many ways, this could be a positive effect for people on the other side of the spectrum. Now for the positive implications of free trade. Free trade lowers companies' business costs because they are able to buy the cheapest resources that are available. Companies are also able to invest in developing economies so that they are able to produce goods in their local environments and at their lower prices. The next idea is known as comparative advantage. This theory states that some countries are able to produce products better than other countries, mostly because of the resources they might have access to. These resources could be natural, a larger labor pool, or even developed technical abilities. This would mean that countries would be able to maximize the efficiency of their production of products they may have an affinity for. Thirdly, free trade usually allows countries to improve their economic growth, or simply their opportunities. Rather than some countries having to rely on a fixed number of individuals or resources, these nations would be able to expand their economies and engage in outside trade that would improve their own domestic economy in other ways. Also, emerging economies provide high profit potential for businesses or companies to invest in. Again, this would mostly be beneficial to smaller countries, as these businesses would be looking for copious amounts of resources to buy at a cheaper price for either production or consumption. As mentioned before, in the negative implications, the consumers often feel the benefits of free trade. This is because they would have access to goods with a cheaper price as well as a wider selection. However, the quality would vary. For example, a consumer may have a choice between a cheaper synthetic coat made in Mexico or an expensive wool coat from Australia. The point would be that they would have access to cheaper goods as well as products of better quality. The small graph on this slide shows us an investigation into the positive implications or effects of trade freedom. This was in cooperation with the World Bank, the International Food Policy Research Institute, as well as Yale University. This shows us that the countries who are more involved in free trade are better off when it comes to having a stronger economy, less hunger, as well as still taking care of the environment. However, as they don't specify what countries they have separated into the 4 categories, it is hard to evaluate any other factors that may have an effect on these results.
The first opinion from a magazine article by Pascal Lamy, director of the World Trade Organization, in the magazine The Land, suggests that free trade is essential for food security. He backs this up with information, which are: 1. MADCs often have the most tax and restriction on food and other goods coming into the country. This is because they know that other countries rely on selling their products to the specific country, as there might be a high demand, and are therefore willing to pay a little bit more to sell it. 2. As many MADCs have high taxes on the food and goods coming into the country, LADCs have a hard time producing and selling their goods to large areas of the world, as well as selling a lot of the product. Pascal Lamy's opinion is in favor of LADCs, as he does not think of the implications free trade of food might have on MADCs. Some MADCs are reliant on their quotas, tariffs, and other taxes that come in and out of their country. At the same time, if the MADC is reliant on a lot of food being imported to the country as a result of unsuitable harvesting and growing environment, then the MADC will be able to save a lot of money on the foods being imported to the country. The second opinion from Dr. Axters, professor at the Harvard University, implies the exact opposite, that there will be a sudden and dramatic increase of food scarcity in LADCs if food is shipped or sent in a free trade market. He backs this up with the fact that LADCs are often in control or have the majority of the markets of food that are rare or cannot be produced in the rest of the world. This means that they will not get as much money for the food that they can export out of the country. At the same time, LADCs that produce more normal foods will be outcompeted by MADCs that produce the exact same food. This is because MADCs often make deals with other MADCs regarding trade. Also, often only the best foods are imported to MADCs, and LADCs have a harder time than MADCs to keep the foods in a perfect condition, as they often cannot afford as much technology and fast transportation